Listen closely, because the story you're about to hear isn't the story your textbooks told you, nor the version politicians like to repeat on anniversaries or in patriotic speeches, but the quiet, uncomfortable reality that unfolded behind closed doors in the months after World War II ended. A reality so painful, so humiliating, and so revealing about the true cost of global power that the British government buried its final chapter for 60 years. We grow up hearing that Britain won the Second World War, that the nation endured, resisted, triumphed, and marched into the post-war world with its head held high. Yet when you peel back the layers of comforting narrative and look at the numbers, the ledgers, the internal memos between London and Washington, and the desperate travels of an aging John Maynard Keynes who was quite literally fighting to save a starving country, you discover that the victory Britain celebrated in 1945 came with a bill so large, so crushing, and so inescapable that it effectively bankrupted the empire and handed the financial crown of the world to the United States. And the most tragic part of this story is that it didn't happen because Britain failed militarily, or because it lacked courage, or because it didn't sacrifice enough. It happened because the war consumed every last financial bone in its body, hollowing the nation out from within until even the great economist Keynes, the man who reshaped the modern world, found himself in Washington begging for terms to keep Britain from sliding into famine. The last payment, a quiet $83 million wire transfer, was made on December 31st, 2006. No announcement, no ceremony. No speeches, just a final silent acknowledgement that Britain had spent 60 years paying for a war it supposedly won. And the secret is this: the moment Britain declared victory in 1945 is the same moment the British Empire began to die. This documentary is the story of how it happened, not in battles, not in strategy rooms, but in banks, in debt, in desperation, and in the quiet collapse of an economic system that had ruled the world for 2 centuries. When the war finally ceased and the streets of London filled with shouts, music, and waving flags, most people believed the worst was behind them. Yet, inside the British Treasury, the atmosphere was utterly different. Ministers were staring at numbers that felt like a death sentence. Foreign reserves drained to almost nothing. Gold supplies depleted, factories destroyed, merchant fleets sunk, and national debt soaring past 200% of GDP, a financial wound deeper than anything Britain had ever suffered in its long imperial history. Britain did not emerge from the war standing tall. It emerged trembling, starving, and held together by ration books and hope. At the height of the conflict, Britain had sold nearly every foreign asset it owned. Railways in Argentina, utilities in India, investments in Canada, liquidating the economic backbone of the empire just to keep feeding the population and buying weapons from the United States. Churchill himself admitted privately that Britain was fighting the war on borrowed time and borrowed money. But nothing prepared the government for what came next. Because just weeks after victory, America delivered the single most devastating financial blow Britain had experienced since losing the American colonies. And it came not from hostility, but from policy. Throughout the war, Britain had depended on a program called Lend-Lease, which allowed it to receive food, ships, weapons, oil, and critical raw materials from the United States without paying up front. It was the lifeline that kept Britain alive. But in September 1945, without warning, without negotiation, without gradual tapering, the United States abruptly ended Lend-Lease with a single telegram. Overnight, Britain's supply chain collapsed. Cargo ships that were halfway across the Atlantic carrying food and fuel were told they would not be released unless Britain paid for them immediately. In dollars, the country no longer had. Factories that relied on American components shut down. The British government, still reeling from 6 years of bombing, stared at the horrifying reality that it now had roughly 6 weeks of food left before the nation began to starve. This moment, quiet, bureaucratic, and almost entirely unknown to the public, was the real breaking point. And into this storm stepped a man who should have spent his final years writing, teaching, and resting, but instead found himself on a transatlantic ship, seasick, frail, and carrying the future of Britain in a battered briefcase. John Maynard Keynes. By 1945, Keynes was no longer the brilliant young economist who rewrote the rules of capitalism. He was a tired, weakened, sharply intelligent older man whose heart was failing and whose body could barely handle the strain of travel. Yet he accepted the mission because he understood what almost no one else did. that Britain's war victory meant nothing unless it secured the food, dollars, and credit needed to survive the peace. He sailed to Washington not as a conqueror, not as an equal, but as a debtor. And the reception he received reflected that reality. American officials respected him. They admired his mind, his wit, his contributions. But they also knew something he could not escape. Britain was broke, and the power dynamic had changed forever. In one private diary entry, an American negotiator wrote, "Britain has come to us like a beggar, not a partner." Keynes wanted a grant, a gesture from the United States acknowledging that Britain had fought for survival not only for itself, but for the future of democracy. He believed, wrongly as it turned out, that America would reward loyalty with generosity. Instead, he was offered a loan. A large one, yes, $433 billion, but a loan with conditions. Conditions that would dismantle the financial core of the British Empire. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946 came with terms Britain desperately tried to resist. The most damaging was forced convertibility. For more than a century, Britain had protected the pound by restricting when foreign nations could convert it into dollars or gold. This allowed the empire to trade internally, using its own currency, maintaining influence and stability. But the Americans insisted, once Britain accepted the loan, the pound had to become freely convertible. This single clause detonated the empire. Because the moment convertibility began, every nation in the sterling zone, India, Australia, South Africa, the colonies, rushed to convert their pounds into dollars, draining Britain's reserves so fast that the government was forced to suspend convertibility after only 6 weeks. It was a humiliation of historic scale, and it signaled the truth. The pound was finished as a global reserve currency. In that moment, without any battlefield, without any treaty humiliation, the world shifted from the British century to the American one. While politicians debated convertibility and global finance, the British people were living through something much more raw and painful. Rationing, which everyone assumed would end with the war, got worse. Bread was rationed for the first time in British history. Fuel allowances dropped, housing was scarce, factories struggled to reopen. Winter after winter, families shivered in cold homes, waiting for coal that never arrived. The empire that had once spanned the world could not feed its own children. By 1947, Britain was so weak economically that the U.S. had to step in again, this time through the Marshall Plan, funneling billions into Europe just to prevent total collapse. But the damage was already done. Britain's empire, stretched thin and financially gutted, began to unravel. India gained independence, the colonies followed, and London no longer had the financial muscle to maintain global control. The war had not just bankrupted Britain, it had ended the British world. From 1950 onward, Britain paid the United States and Canada in slow, painful installments. Governments changed. Prime ministers came and went. Wars were fought. The Berlin Wall rose and fell. The internet was invented, and still the payments continued. Finally, on December 31st, 2006, the last payment, $83 million, left the Treasury. 60 years, 2 generations. A financial shadow that followed Britain long after the bombs stopped falling. This isn't just a tale about the past, it is a warning, because history shows that great powers don't collapse when they lose battles. They collapse when they lose the ability to fund their existence. They collapse when debt rises beyond reason, when printing becomes survival, when foreign nations begin to doubt their currency, when they must sell assets just to eat. Britain reached that point in 1945. And some argue the United States is drifting toward its own version today. But that is another story. Great powers fall quietly, not loudly. Empires die from balance sheets, not battlefields. And the most devastating defeats are paid in installments.